On the bridge display, the route kept moving. A Chinese-linked tanker entered the Strait of Hormuz after Washington had already told the world the line was closed, the American blockade was supposed to be absolute. The message from the White House was simple enough for every market, every navy, and every government to understand. No ship gets through, not now. Not under this order. No missile plume, no burst of gunfire, no cinematic collision, no officer barking into a radio while the world held its breath. Just a ship advancing through the most sensitive energy corridor on Earth, while the line that was supposed to stop it behaved less like a wall and more like a warning. Nobody wanted to cash. That is the moment that matters. And the real story is not the tanker. The real story is that America discovered, in public, the exact point where its announced power met its real enforcement limit. That is what the world saw in Hormuz for a very long time. The United States did not need to explain that kind of line. If Washington drew it, the line existed because everybody else assumed the cost of testing it would be unbearable. That assumption did not come from speeches. It came from habit. It came from fleets, carriers, logistics, alliances, intelligence, air power, and a 70-year record of being the one navy nobody serious wanted to challenge in a vital corridor. That old habit is what made the declaration sound credible the moment it was spoken. It is also what made this crossing so dangerous. Because what happened in Hormuz was not just that a ship moved. What happened was that a line announced with maximal confidence ran into a reality Washington could not control cleanly once Chinese interests were sitting inside the route. That is the whole structure. I want to use one framework for everything that follows, because without it, this becomes just another noisy crisis story. The framework is the enforcement trap. An enforcement trap is what happens when a great power announces a line that sounds strong at the level of rhetoric. But every realistic way of making that line fully real carries a price too large for the announcing power to pay comfortably. Once that happens, the question is no longer whether the line sounds forceful. The question is whether the other side has realized that enforcement is more dangerous than violation. In Hormuz, China realized it, and once China realized it, the blockade stopped being only an Iran story. It became a credibility story. It became a world order story. The Strait of Hormuz is only a narrow strip of water on the map, but it sits on top of a much wider reality. A huge share of the world's energy flows through it. Oil markets react to it in minutes. Insurance companies build risk around it. Asian importers live on it. European policymakers fear it. Gulf states calculate around it. When something breaks in Hormuz, it does not stay in Hormuz. It travels into fuel prices, freight costs, stock markets, diplomacy, alliance behavior, and military planning. That is why this episode matters so much more than the size of the ship itself. Washington announced a blockade with the language of certainty because certainty is part of the weapon. A blockade does not work only because ships can be intercepted. It works because enough people believe interception is likely enough, expensive enough, and painful enough to obey before being touched. That is why credibility matters more than theatrics. Once traders, governments, and rival powers begin to suspect that a blockade is selective, constrained, and dependent on the challenger in front of it, the blockade starts changing shape. It no longer looks absolute. It starts looking negotiated. That is the danger. And the challenger in front of it this time was not some disposable actor. It was a Chinese-linked vessel. That single detail changes the whole geometry of the situation. If this had been a small militia craft or an unprotected smuggling vessel, Washington could have acted with very different levels of freedom. But a Chinese-linked commercial ship moving through a vital global choke point while the United States is publicly asserting total control is not a tactical detail. It is a geopolitical trigger. The minute American forces physically stop, seize, or dramatically confront that vessel, the issue is no longer maritime enforcement inside an Iran crisis. The issue becomes a direct challenge to Chinese commercial rights, Chinese prestige, Chinese energy security, and Chinese status as a great power. Beijing does not need to answer that with a naval battle to make the cost severe. It can answer in stages, it can answer through trade, It can answer through supply chains. It can answer through markets. It can answer through a sustained pattern of maritime testing. It can answer diplomatically while keeping escalation hanging in the air. And that is exactly why the trap exists. Because once the line touches China, every American option gets worse. If Washington stops the ship, it risks opening a US-China confrontation in one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth. If Washington does not stop the ship, the world begins asking the question Washington most needed to avoid. Is this really a blockade, or is it a blockade until the price of enforcing it rises? That question is where credibility starts bleeding, and credibility never bleeds only in one place. It bleeds into markets first because markets are ruthless about ambiguity. If enforcement is uncertain, risk goes up, insurance goes up, freight goes up, price expectations go up. A policy that looks absolute in a statement but conditional in execution creates the worst kind of premium, the premium of uncertainty. Traders can price a closed route. They can price an open route. What they fear most is a route governed by power statements that may or may not survive contact with the next challenger. Then credibility bleeds into alliances because allies do not need the United States to sound strong. They need the United States to be predictable. Gulf monarchies want protection, but they do not want to become collateral in a US-China collision. European governments want stable energy markets, not a doctrinal lecture about maritime order followed by another oil shock. Asian economies want shipping security, but many of them also depend on Chinese trade. The louder Washington sounds before the test, the more carefully allies watch the moment of enforcement. They are not looking for drama. They are looking for the gap, and in Hormuz, they saw one. Then credibility bleeds into military planning. Every navy in the world studies episodes like this because great powers reveal themselves in edge cases. They reveal themselves not when the opponent is weak and isolated, but when the opponent is strong enough, connected enough, and expensive enough to confront. That is what makes this crossing travel far beyond the Gulf. It will be studied in the South China Sea. It will be studied in the Taiwan Strait. It will be studied in every capital that may one day hear Washington announce another line with confidence and then wonder what happens when the line meets a challenger carrying real geopolitical weight. That is why the crossing mattered. Not because China defeated the US Navy in some childish cinematic sense, but because China forced the United States to reveal that a line touching Chinese interests is no longer a line America can simply speak into existence. To understand why the trap was so effective, you have to look at Iran's design. Iran did not choose the simplest form of disruption. It did not simply shut Hormuz to everyone and dare the world to respond in one unified wave. That would have been reckless. That would have pushed too many countries into one camp at the same time. Instead, Iran used selective access. Friends and useful partners moved. Enemies and close Western allies faced exclusion, friction, or danger. That is not chaos. That is political architecture. Iran turned the strait into a sorting mechanism that matters because selective access creates different calculations for different actors. It gives China a reason to keep moving. It gives India and Pakistan room to think. It gives Gulf governments a more complicated map. It gives Washington a more crowded board. And crowded boards are harder for one power to dominate cleanly, even if that power still has superior force. This is why treating Hormuz as a pure naval story misses the point. Naval power is only the visible layer. Underneath it sits the energy layer. Underneath that sits the commercial layer. Underneath that sits the alliance layer. Underneath that sits the escalation layer. And under all of it sits the political psychology layer, the layer where everyone is silently adjusting to what they think the new limits really are. That deeper stack favors patience, leverage, and entanglement. China has spent years building all three. There is a reason Beijing could stay calm. China is not just another customer in this story. China sits deep inside the energy and industrial equation on both sides. A huge share of Iranian export flow matters to Chinese refiners, and China in turn sits inside supply chains. The United States still cannot painlessly unwind. That means any confrontation in Hormuz is never confined to ships alone. It immediately echoes into rare earths, manufacturing inputs, electronics, industrial planning. inflation, and the broader trade struggle already hanging over the relationship. When two powers are this entangled, the threat of enforcement is never just naval, it is economic all the way down. That is why Beijing did not need to sound hysterical. It only needed to let Washington understand that a maritime confrontation in Hormuz would not stay maritime for very long. People like to talk about crises as if history begins the morning the headline appears. But what happened in Hormuz did not begin with the crossing. It began years earlier when China embedded itself more deeply into the economic life of the Gulf, when it made itself too large to ignore in energy markets, when it built commercial dependence that could not be surgically separated from strategic conflict. By the time the route was tested, Beijing was not improvising from zero. It was drawing on scale, trade centrality, commodity leverage, industrial depth, and the simple fact that too much of the world now has to calculate around China at the same time. That is real power, not always loud power, not always cinematic power, but power that shows up when someone else tries to make a universal rule and discovers there is one actor too big to treat as ordinary. And once that actor appears, Washington's option tree turns ugly very fast. The first road is strict enforcement. Stop the ship, interdict it, make the blockade literal, show the world that a line is a line. That sounds strong. It also means turning a shipping confrontation into the front edge of a direct U.S. China crisis in a waterway carrying a major share of the world's energy flows. Beijing would be forced into its own response tree because no major power can publicly allow its interests to be treated as weightless forever. Maybe China responds economically, maybe diplomatically, maybe through future escort patterns, maybe through more aggressive testing, maybe through all of them in sequence. What began as maritime enforcement becomes the ignition point for a much wider struggle that Washington may not have wanted to start over one tanker in one corridor. The second road is selective tolerance. Let certain crossings happen while preserving the broad public language of control. This avoids the immediate US-China rupture, but it creates an equally dangerous signal. It tells every observer that enforcement depends not on the policy itself, but on who is challenging it and how expensive that challenge is. Once adversaries learn that, they stop reading the headline and start searching for the cost threshold. That is how deterrence becomes probing. Not dead, just negotiable. The third road is quiet narrowing. Keep the rhetoric maximal. Quietly practice something narrower. Enforce around the edges, pretend the gap will remain blurry. That might have worked in another era. It does not work cleanly. Now, commercial ship tracking exists. Satellite imagery exists, open. Source intelligence exists. Insurance data exists. Modern crises leave public records. A selective blockade is very hard to disguise when half the world can watch the route in near real time. The more visible the difference becomes between public declaration and practical behavior, the more the performance starts working against the performer. The fourth road is multilateral enforcement. Bring in allies. Make the line look collective, spread risk, turn American will into coalition will. In theory, that is the cleanest answer. In practice, energy crises reveal how thin coalition appetite can be when China is on one side of the equation and oil prices are on the other. Gulf states fear escalation. Europe fears another shock. Asian importers fear disruption. Many governments want the benefits of American security architecture without paying the cost of visibly joining a confrontation that could scramble energy markets and trade flows at the same time. Coalition politics always sound firmer in briefing rooms than they feel when refineries and markets are counting the days. That is why the trap is so powerful. Every road out carries a cost. Every cost pushes the story upward. Every upward move makes the confrontation less about one ship and more about the architecture of global power. And that is exactly what China needed. China did not have to win a naval battle to make its point. It only had to make Washington choose between bad options while the whole world watched. That is a very modern form of power, and Iran understood it too. Iran was never going to outfight the United States conventionally. That was never the real bet. The real bet was that the route, the markets, the regional dependencies, and the presence of China inside the system would make a clean American solution impossible. Once the crisis geometry became crowded enough, military superiority would still matter, but freedom of action would narrow. That is the distinction most people miss. Power and freedom of action are not the same thing. You can have more force and fewer usable moves. That is what Hormuz revealed. America is still the strongest navy on earth. Nothing in this episode changes that basic fact. But strength is not the same thing as automatic control over every politically connected consequence of using that strength. Once Chinese interests are sitting inside the route, once Gulf partners fear wider damage, once markets are bracing for price shocks, once allies are hedging, once ship movements are public and the rhetoric has gone maximal, the strongest navy in the world can still find itself operating inside a much narrower political corridor than its admirers imagine. That narrowing is the story. A lot of people will try to flatten this into something stupid and comforting. They will say this proves American decline in some total sense. That is too easy. Others will say it means nothing, that the United States remains overwhelmingly strong and therefore the crossing should be dismissed as noise. That is too shallow. The truth is harder and more important. This moment did not prove that China now rules the water. It proved that the age in which an American declaration automatically created an uncontested operational reality in every vital corridor is fading. That is a much more serious statement because once that fades, every actor starts adjusting, Gulf monarchies become more careful, European governments become more hedged. Asian importers become more pragmatic, energy traders become more cynical, insurance firms become more sensitive to the difference between declared policy and usable policy. Smaller states learn that in a crowded system, survival may come from forcing great powers to compete inside the same constrained space rather than choosing one completely. This is how world order changes in real life, not with one speech, not with one summit, not with one ship alone. It changes when enough actors begin quietly updating their sense of what lines are real, what costs are unbearable, and what risks great powers are actually prepared to accept. That update is mental before it is material. First comes skepticism, then comes hedging, then comes new behavior. Then comes a new order. I think Hormuz pushed that first stage forward. What troubles Washington most is not that China resisted. Resistance is normal. Great, power competition without resistance is fantasy. What should trouble Washington is that the line was announced in a way that made public testing almost inevitable while leaving the actual enforcement choices politically poisonous. That is the danger of ruling by theatrical declaration in a system where rivals are patient, economically entangled, and very capable of reading where your escalation ceiling really sits. The crowd cheers when the line is announced. The real judgment arrives 1 hour later when the line is tested. And in Hormuz, it was tested. The ship moved. The route held. The rhetoric stayed absolute. The reality did not. That record will not disappear. Years from now, this episode will still matter because it captured in miniature the larger transition already underway. The United States still possesses greater force. China increasingly possesses more ways to make the use of that force politically, economically, and strategically costly. Iran, sitting at the top of one of the world's most important choke points, understood how to exploit that reality more intelligently than many expected. That is why this was never just about oil. Energy is only the first consequence. After energy comes diplomacy. Because allies want to know whether Washington is still setting rules or merely setting opening bids. After diplomacy comes military signaling because every serious state wants to know how American enforcement behaves when the challenger is not weak. After military signaling comes something deeper, political psychology. Once enough governments start thinking an American line may be negotiable under the right pressure, they act differently long before any formal doctrine changes. That is how old orders begin to drown. Not because they vanish overnight, because the water gets crowded, because more actors enter. Because the strongest actor discovers that every move now collides with costs it used to keep outside the room, because lines that once ended arguments now begin negotiations. That is the warning sitting inside this crossing. If you want the bluntest version, here it is. The real story is not that China crossed a blockade. The real story is that that a blockade touching Chinese interests had become a negotiation before it became a fact. And once a superpower's line becomes a negotiation, everyone starts redrawing their maps. That is what every capital is filing away. Now the Gulf states are filing it away. Europe is filing it away. Asia is filing it away. Every navy is filing it away. Every market is filing it away, because lessons like this do not stay in one strait. They travel into oil prices. They travel into alliance planning. They travel into trade routes. They travel into war games. They travel into the next crisis and the crisis after that. This is why Hormuz should not be read as a passing embarrassment or a one-day headline. It should be read as a structural warning. The line was American. The crossing was Chinese. The lesson belonged to everyone. And the most dangerous part is what comes after the lesson. Because the moment a superpower's line becomes negotiable, the water is no longer its own.